Hello! I bring you my family revenge, which is called, My cousin took over the will reading like he owned everything. Then the lawyer read my name last. You won't believe what happened at the lawyer's office last week. I'm still processing it all because, honestly, I never imagined that my Aunt Margaret's death would reveal so many family secrets. And look, I thought I knew my family well, but it turns out I was wrong about a lot of things. It all started when we got the call about the funeral. Aunt Margaret was always the matriarch of the family. That strong woman who everyone respected, but who also kept everyone in line. She never married, never had children, and for years we all speculated about what would happen to her fortune when the time came. Because, let's be honest here, she had money, lots of money. Her house in Connecticut was a 3-story Victorian mansion with a garden that looked like something out of a magazine. She had investments, stocks, bank accounts that no one knew exactly how much they had. And of course, there were always those veiled comments at family gatherings about who would be the main heir. My cousin Robert always behaved as if he were the chosen one. He is the son of Aunt Margaret's older brother, and she has shown a certain preference for him since he was little. Robert grew up knowing this, and over the years he cultivated this closeness in a way that, to be honest, always bothered me a little. It's not that I had any expectations about the inheritance, but there was something about the way he behaved that made me a little uncomfortable. During the wake, Robert naturally assumed the role of organizer. He spoke to the pastor, received condolences, and coordinated the floral arrangements. My mother, Sarah, who is Aunt Margaret's sister, sat quietly in the corner, still processing the loss. They were very close, despite the age difference. Aunt Margaret was 15 years older and always took care of my mother as if she were a second mother. I watched all that activity, helping where I could, but mainly trying to provide emotional support for my mother. Her death had been sudden, a heart attack while she was gardening. At least it had been quick, the doctors said. She hadn't suffered. 3 days after the funeral, we received the summons for the reading of the will. The lawyer's office was in downtown Hartford, one of those old, stately buildings that exude seriousness. When we arrived, Robert was already there, sitting in the chair closest to the lawyer's desk, as if that were his rightful place. In attendance were me, my mother Sarah, Robert, my cousin Jennifer, Robert's sister, my uncle William, Robert and Jennifer's father, and a few other distant cousins whom I rarely see at family gatherings. The atmosphere was tense, all of us curious but trying to maintain respectful composure. The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, was a man in his 60s with gray hair and gold-rimmed glasses. He had the solemn demeanor typical of someone who has dealt with these situations for decades. He put on his glasses, picked up the document, and began to talk about the legal procedures, explaining how the reading would work. It was at this point that Robert did something that left me completely disconcerted. He leaned forward and said, "Mr. Peterson, if you'll allow me, since I was the closest to Aunt Margaret and she always consulted me about important decisions, perhaps I could help clarify any doubts that arose during the reading." The lawyer looked at him with a neutral expression and replied, "Mr. Robert, I appreciate your willingness, but I believe the will is quite clear in its provisions." But Robert insisted, "It's just that I know her intentions well, you know. We talked a lot about the family's future, about how she would like her assets to be managed. She always told me that she trusted me to take care of everything." At that moment, I felt a chill in my stomach. It wasn't exactly what Robert was saying, but the way he was saying it. There was a certainty there, a presumption that bothered me deeply. I glanced at my mother and saw that she was also uncomfortable, fidgeting nervously with the strap of her purse. Mr. Peterson maintained his professional composure and began reading. The first few items were smaller, some jewelry for distant cousins, an antique watch for my Uncle William, books for the local library. Robert listened to each item as it was read with a knowing expression, nodding approvingly as if he were overseeing the process. When it came to the real estate, Robert leaned forward even more. The main house in Connecticut, valued at over $2 million, would go to Jennifer. Yes, Robert's sister, not him. I saw the surprise on his face. But he quickly composed himself and said, "Oh yes, that makes sense. Jennifer always loved that house." But I could hear the tension in his voice. This was clearly not what he had expected. Mr. Peterson read on. Stocks and other investments in a substantial portfolio would be divided among various family members. Robert would receive a sizable portion, which seemed to appease him somewhat. My mother was also given a significant amount, which made me genuinely happy for her. Then came some specific provisions that no one had expected. Aunt Margaret had left a substantial amount to a local charity that cared for abandoned animals. Robert frowned at this and muttered something about money down the drain, which irritated me greatly. How could he judge her choices? There was also an educational fund set up to pay for the education of needy children in the community. Another $500,000 was earmarked for that. Robert was visibly restless now, mentally calculating how much was taking away from the main estate. Mr. Peterson paused, took a sip of water, and said, "Now we come to the final and most significant provisions of the will." Robert sat up straighter in his chair, clearly expecting to hear his name called to receive the bulk of the estate. There was still the summer home on Martha's Vineyard, several substantial bank accounts, and an art collection worth a fortune. "The property on Martha's Vineyard," Mr. Peterson began, "including all furnishings and equipment, goes to my nephew William." My uncle was visibly moved. That house had enormous sentimental value to the family. Robert was mentally calculating what was left. There were still the major bills and the art collection. He shifted in his chair, bracing himself for his name to be called. The checking and savings accounts, totaling approximately $1.8 million, are divided as follows. Mr. Peterson listed several people, including Robert, who would receive a sizable portion, but not the bulk of it as he had clearly expected. Then came the art collection. These were valuable pieces, some by renowned artists, amassed over decades. The entire art collection, Mr. Peterson said, including paintings, sculptures, and other works, will go to my niece Sarah. My mother was shocked. She had known that some of the pieces were valuable, but she had no idea of the total value of the collection. We would later learn that it was worth over $500,000. Robert was becoming visibly agitated. He had come into a substantial inheritance, don't get me wrong, but it was clearly not what he had expected. He was not the primary heir. He was not the one receiving the bulk of the estate. Mr. Peterson looked around the room and said, "There is one final provision, a special legacy, that Mrs. Margaret made a point of highlighting in her will." That's when my heart started beating faster. I don't know why, but something told me that my name would be mentioned. Maybe it was intuition, maybe it was hope, but I felt a strange energy in the air. "To my great niece," Mr. Peterson paused and looked directly at me. "To Elizabeth, who has always shown a genuine interest in our family history and a sincere affection for this old lady, I leave the most precious possession to me." I felt the blood rush to my face. Robert turned to look at me with an expression I will never forget. A mixture of surprise, indignation, and something that almost seemed like anger. Mr. Peterson continued. "I leave to Elizabeth the Vermont homestead, including the main house, farmland, and timberland, totaling 150 acres, and a separate trust fund established for the maintenance and preservation of the property, in the amount of $800,000. The silence in the room was deafening. I could barely process what I was hearing. The Vermont homestead was where Aunt Margaret spent her summers when she was young, where she always said she found peace. She had taken me there a few times when I was a child, and I had always talked about how much I loved it there, how I dreamed of owning a home in the country one day. But there was more. Mr. Peterson wasn't done. "In addition," he continued, "Elizabeth will also receive my personal jewelry collection, including the diamond set that belonged to our grandmother, and a special account I have created specifically for her, valued at $1.2 million. At that point, Robert could contain himself no longer. He stood up abruptly and said, "With all due respect, Mr. Peterson, but that doesn't make sense. Elizabeth barely visited Aunt Margaret. I was the one who took care of everything, the one who was always there, the one who helped with the important decisions. Mr. Peterson looked at him with that professional expression and replied, "Mr. Robert, I can assure you that this will was very carefully drafted by Mrs. Margaret. She was in perfect mental condition when she signed it, just 6 months ago, and she made sure to include an explanatory letter about her decisions." An explanatory letter. My heart skipped a beat. The lawyer opened a sealed envelope and began to read. "If you are reading this letter, it means that I am gone, and I hope you understand my choices. Throughout my life, I have carefully observed each member of our family, their characters, their motivations, their ways of showing love." Robert sat down again, but he was visibly tense. The letter continued. "Robert, my dear nephew, you have always been ambitious and determined, qualities I admire, but over the years, I have come to realize that your attention to me was largely tied to expectations about my inheritance. Your visits became more frequent when I began to talk about making my will. Your attention, while appreciated, was accompanied by questions about my assets and future plans." The discomfort in the room was palpable. Robert was blushing, but he could not argue because deep down we all knew there was some truth to his words. Elizabeth, on the other hand, the letter continued, "has always visited me simply for the pleasure of my company. She listened to my stories about family, showed genuine interest in the traditions I cherish so much. When I took her to Vermont, I saw in her eyes the same love for that land that I had always felt. She did not ask about money. She did not speculate about inheritances. She simply loved me as her great aunt." I felt tears begin to form in my eyes. It was true. I truly loved Aunt Margaret for who she was, not for what she had. The letter had more. "I want Elizabeth to preserve the Vermont property as a family gathering place where future generations can connect with our roots. The trust I have left her is to be used exclusively for the upkeep of the property and to ensure that it remains in the family." Mr. Peterson folded the letter and looked around the room. "There is one final provision. Mrs. Margaret has asked that I personally deliver this to Elizabeth." He handed me a small envelope with my name handwritten on it from Aunt Margaret. With shaking hands, I opened it and read, "Dear Elizabeth, I know this inheritance may seem like a burden, but I trust you to take care of what is most precious to our family, our memories and traditions. Use this gift not only for your own benefit, but to keep our family together. And remember, the true value of an inheritance is not in the money, but in the love that motivates it." When I finished reading, I looked around and saw a variety of expressions. My mother was excited and proud. Jennifer seemed genuinely happy for me. My Uncle William had a smile on his face. But Robert was clearly processing a very different reality than he had imagined. Mr. Peterson concluded the meeting by explaining the next legal steps, the deadlines for transferring property, and the necessary paperwork. As we left the office, Robert approached me. "Elizabeth," he said, trying to keep his tone friendly, but I could hear the tension in his voice. "I hope you understand the responsibility this entails. Managing property, especially one in Vermont, is not easy. If you'd like some help managing it all, I have experience in investments and estates." I looked at him and realized that even after everything that had happened, he still hadn't fully understood Aunt Margaret's message. He was still thinking in terms of control and stewardship, not in terms of love and preservation. "Thank you, Robert," I replied diplomatically, "but I think I'll learn as I go. Aunt Margaret trusted me, and I intend to honor that trust." In the days that followed, word of the inheritance spread through the extended family. I received calls from relatives I barely knew, some offering advice, others clearly interested in reaching out. But I also received calls from people like my cousin Jennifer, who told me how happy she was that Aunt Margaret had chosen someone who would truly value the family legacy. The property in Vermont is even more beautiful than I remembered. When I visited last week, I sat on the porch of the main house and could feel Aunt Margaret's presence. I understood why she loved this place so much. And I also understood why she trusted me to preserve it. Robert eventually came to terms with the situation, although I realized there is still some awkwardness between us at family gatherings. But most importantly, I learned something valuable about family relationships and the difference between genuine love and self-interest. Aunt Margaret, with her wisdom, managed to teach us all a final lesson about what really matters. And I intend to carry that lesson with me as I nurture the legacy she left me. The Vermont property is now being prepared to welcome the family next summer. It will be the first official family reunion there, and I am sure Aunt Margaret would be proud to see the family reunited in the place she loves so much. If you liked this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Leave your opinion in the comments. I'll be here, and until next time.